When learning to pronounce Mandarin, you need to learn both the sounds and how they are written, usually with Pinyin. Did you know that many student errors actually come from a poor understanding of Pinyin, rather than the sounds themselves being difficult? Welcome to my guide to Pinyin traps and pitfalls. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about pronunciation, and more specifically, we're going to talk about Pinyin and how it sometimes, or rather often actually, can trip up students when it comes to accurate pronunciation. This is related to something we talked about in episode 38, which was about pronunciation and Pinyin and how they are different. And to summarize what we said then very briefly, pronunciation is of course the sounds that we use in the language, including tones and so on, and Pinyin is just the letters we use to write these down on a piece of paper. So these two are distinct, and one consequence of mixing them up is that you don't really know if a mistake you've made with your pronunciation is because you have pronounced the sound incorrectly, or it is that you are actually aiming for the wrong sound because you've misunderstood how Pinyin works. So even if these two types of errors look similar on the surface, they can indeed look identical from a teacher point of view, for example, it's important to realize that they are very different in terms of what you need to do. If you've misunderstood how Pinyin works, that is actually rather easy. You just need to learn a few simple spelling rules, and you will then be able to aim for the right sound, which of course makes it possible to also pronounce the right sound. On the other hand, if you're having a problem with the sound itself, that might not be as easy to fix. And this is not something that I can cover in a single podcast episode, but fortunately I do have a pronunciation course where I go through everything you need to know about Mandarin pronunciation, including everything about Pinyin, of course. The course is open for enrollment until January 18th, 2022, and you can find out more about the course by going to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com or using the link in the description. If you listen to this after the course has closed, you will be able to leave your email address so that I can notify you when the course opens again. In this podcast episode, though, I want to address the easier of the two problems, i.e. sorting out how Pinyin actually works, and I will do that by focusing on some of the most common mistakes and errors that students make. And of course, I hope this will be useful whether or not you're interested in my course. Misunderstandings about how Pinyin works can of course come from a number of different sources. It can be because the teacher didn't really teach it properly. It could be because the students are overwhelmed at the beginning of the semester and there are so many other things to pay attention to that even though the teacher did go through this, you didn't really notice it or you don't remember it now. And of course, in some cases, it can be that the student is a little bit lazy and treats Pinyin as if it were English, which is one of the worst mistakes you can make. You should, in essence, never guess how Pinyin is pronounced. You should know or look it up so that you know next time. You should never base your reading of what you know of another language, such as English, French, German, or whatever. Mandarin is obviously not any of these languages and is very distant from these languages, so just because a letter looks the same on the page, it doesn't mean that the sound is similar. So most of these errors actually come from assuming that something is pronounced in a way that it isn't. This also leads me to another important lesson, and that is to start with listening. If you start with listening and then learn how the sounds are written down, you don't really have these problems. Most of these problems arise from people basing their pronunciation practice on the written form of the sounds. So don't do that. Listen as much as you can, pay attention, and then learn how these sounds are written down and learn it properly. I have sorted this episode into several categories, and in the first we're going to look at vowel omissions, so that would be abbreviated syllables, i.e. syllables that actually have fewer letters on the page than there are sounds. Then we're going to look at vowel overlap, so that's when we use one letter, a vowel in this case, to represent more than one sound. And this is of course something you need to be aware of, so you don't pronounce these the same way. The third category is related to the N or NG ending in Pinyin. And the fourth category is about aspirated and non-aspirated consonants, and don't worry if you don't know what that means now, I will explain. And in the fifth category, we will talk about some miscellaneous questions about why Chinese is so confusing, or at least why many students perceive it to be so. So let's dive into the first category, which is vowel omissions. And the first example is IU, and in this episode I will spell these letters in English, so IU are the letters I and U, and then I will give examples in Chinese to show you what I mean. So this example, IU, is actually an abbreviation of IOU, And you can hear this rather clearly in syllables like dio, lio, nio, and so on. So to throw something away is dio, and the number 6 is lio. So here we are passing through 3 sounds, that's I, O, and U, and if you skip one of them, it's going to be wrong. There are native speakers who do that, so for example, you could hear people say diu, but this is not standard pronunciation, and you should say dio. Case number 2 is the final spelled ui, which is actually pronounced uei. Some example syllables here are dui, tui, shui, and so on. And a common example might be the word for water, which is shui, and this is u-e-i, shu-u-e, shui. It is not shui or something like that, which it would be if we didn't have the e in there. So remember that ui is actually uei. Case number 3 is the final spelled un, which is actually pronounced uen. This one varies a bit between native speakers and also between different syllables, but what I'm getting at here is that the word for spring is pronounced chun. It is not pronounced chun. If I were to exaggerate the pronunciation, it would be chun, chun, and nobody says that, but that is in the direction you should move if you are indeed saying chun, which sounds weird. This can be very clear on certain syllables. So for example, third tone, if we have a word like gun, which means to roll, you can hear the gun. It is not gun, gun. That sounds even more off than chun. You don't need to stress this too much, so I'm not saying that there are always 2 distinctly clear vowel sounds here, but there should at least be a hint of the un at the end. Let's continue with the 4th and last case when it comes to abbreviated syllables, and that is the syllable spelled with an O, but which is mostly pronounced as if it was written UO. That would mean that a syllable like bo, which means wave, rhymes with a syllable like do, which means many. So one with a B and one with a D. And the first one with a B is spelled with BO, and the other one is spelled DUO. But these sound more or less the same. You could argue that the sounds here are similar because the lip rounding here, the U sound that comes in the middle, actually comes from the initial, from the consonant, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes here. The practical upshot of this is that they do sound very similar, and if you try to pronounce bo, po, mo, and fo with only an O sound, it would be bo, po, mo, fo, and this is not how people pronounce these sounds. That means we are ready to move on to category number 2, which is vowel overlap. So that's when we're using one vowel, one letter, to write more than one sound. This is, of course, very important to be aware of when you are reading Pinyin, as it were, because if you think that all these vowels stand for the same sounds, you are bound to make mistakes. The first example is the letter E, which can represent 4 different sounds. So first we have a sound in Hungary, ua. And depending on region, this can be pronounced as a literal diphthong, i.e. having 2 vowel sounds, like that. Or it can be more one sound, as in, for example, elder brother, gua. This sound is rather weird for speakers of most other languages because it's something fairly unusual. It's a close back unrounded vowel, and those are fairly uncommon. Like I said, I can't go through everything about basic pronunciation in this podcast episode, but in my pronunciation course there's a whole lesson about this specific sound, or various ways of pronouncing it. The second type of E is the one that comes before the nasals N and NG. So for example in cold, lung, lung. So this is just a central, easy, relaxed There is nothing weird about this sound, it's just lung. This sound is also used in many common reduced syllables such as d, l, and so on. The third and fourth type of E I will discuss together here because they are rather similar and you don't have to make a difference between these, and the difference is indeed quite small. But we're talking about the syllables E, I and I, E. So for example, if we have the characters lie, which means inferior, for example, and lei, which means tired, these E's are not identical. In lie, it's slightly more relaxed, it's farther down, or more open, if you will. And in the other case, lei, it is more closed and a little bit higher up. And like I said, this is not crucial, but you might have noticed that these are pronounced slightly differently, and most of you probably haven't, and you might even do it correctly without thinking about it too much. I should also say, as is the case with many of these examples, that different speakers do say these things slightly differently, even if they have similar pronunciation otherwise. So it can be a speaker-to-speaker difference sometimes. Next, we're going to look at the letter A, which can represent 3 different sounds. And the first of these is a nice central open a, as in jia or I or an. And this is usually not too problematic, but do note that this is not the same a sound as in English, so don't say an. It's supposed to be an. Next, we also have an a that comes before ng or o. And for example, we have this in lao, as in old lao. And this a here is further back into the mouth. And you can almost feel that even if you're not very familiar with phonetic terminology. Lao, it's closer to the throat, as it were. Lao. And this is also true for, say, a syllable like, I don't know, wolf, lang, lang, it's further back. Then we have the third type of a, which most beginners notice immediately, but many native speakers don't even think about. And that is the a in words like tian, for example, sky or day. And that is spelled T-I-A-N, but it's pronounced tien. It is not pronounced tian, even if there are Chinese people who say that too. Worth noting is that this also happens after ü, not just after i. So for example, when you have the u with the dots, even if they are not written out, more about that later, you still need this different a sound here. So for example, in a word like juan, that's J-U-A-N, juan, it is still n, it's not juan or something like that. This should be pretty clear if you contrast the juan we just had now with duan, which is spelled D-U-A-N, and here we have a normal an, so it should be duan and juan, and you can hear that these are definitely not the same final. Then number 3 is everybody's favorite, the letter I, which can stand for at least 4 different sounds. The first one is pretty easy, it's just a little bit further forward and higher up than the normal I in English. So this would be in syllables like ni, for example, I, nothing strange here. Then when it appears after some other vowels, such as a, you get a syllable like y, like outside, y. And the final sound there is not as far forward and not as high up as the I, you're not saying y. But this usually doesn't cause too much trouble for learners. The third type of I is the one that comes after Z, C, and S, and those will be pronounced z, c, and s. And you can hear that it's not z, c, and c or something like that, it's z, c, s. And this sounds a little bit weird to most students because it's not a normal vowel. It's produced with a tongue tip, which is pretty unusual, and it's therefore fairly similar to an English Z, actually, a voiced S. It has more air coming through, and it's not identical, but it's not too far away either. Next, we have the I that comes after ZH, CH, SH, and R, and this would be zh, ch, sh, r, and these sounds. And like the previous one, this is also produced with the tip of the tongue, so it's actually close to the R sound. So if you think of, say, SHI, as in, say, sh, to be, if you think of it as being spelled SHR, you are not too far off. Not identical again, but pretty close. Sh. And as a teacher, I can use these sounds to see if a student has actually studied the pronunciation or if they're just reading Pinyin. Because if you say she, I know that you've never listened to anybody say this, but you're just reading the word off the page. The final type of overlap we're going to look at today is the letter U being used to represent 2 completely different sounds. And this causes no end of trouble for most students, and this is something you absolutely have to learn from day 1 preferably. So the basic sound here is the one in, for example, road, lu, or in tree, shu. And these are spelled L-U and S-H-U respectively. Then we have another sound which is spelled U but with 2 dots on it, and this is U. This is sometimes easy to see, so if you have the word for woman, nu, you can see the dots, and at least if you have a problem with this sound, it is because of the sound itself, not because you have misunderstood how Pinyin works. But then we have a large set of syllables that start with J, Q, X, and Y, where the dots are not written out, and this is what you really need to pay attention to. So for example, we have the word to go, tu, which is written Q-U. There are no dots there, but this is not an U sound, it is an U sound, and you need to remember this. So after J, Q, X, and Y, you need to add the dots, and this is always the case. Okay, that was category 2, and now we have 2 smaller categories before we round this off. So in category 3, I've simply put the finals in, ing, an, ang, and so these end with n or ng. And I simply want to point out that even though the vowels here look the same, they aren't actually the same. And some of this we actually already covered. So you know, for example, from the previous discussion that an and ang don't use the same a sound. Another thing worth pointing out, and this is also dependent on speaker and region a bit, but in northern China, for example, this is common, is to make a pretty big difference between yin, that's in, and ying, that's ying. So the difference is that some speakers insert an sound in here. It's very light, but it's definitely audible. If you take a syllable like xing, as in okay, or let's go for that, it's not just xing, it's xing. And if I were to exaggerate the difference, it would be xiang, although I think few people actually say that. Okay, let's move on to category number 4, which is about aspirated and non-aspirated consonants. An aspiration is simply a puff of air that follows the consonant. So we have this, for example, in a word like put in English. We have the p, we have the breath of air there coming after the p, and this is called aspiration. And this is very important in Mandarin. It is also stronger than it is in English. And indeed, consonant pairs are mainly distinguished by aspiration. So, for example, B and P, the main difference between those is aspiration. And I'm not going to go into a full discussion about voicing and aspiration here. It is rather complicated in English as well, but just know that when you learn Chinese, you need to remember to aspirate the P, T, K, and so on properly, and that none of these are normally voiced. In fact, there are only 5 consonant sounds that are normally voiced, and that is M, N, G, L, and R. So let's round this off by talking about the Y. Because if you've been learning Chinese for a while, you might be confused and maybe also a little frustrated that there are so many inconsistencies and rules you need to keep track of. Of course, it's much easier than to learn to spell English or something like that, but it's still less consistent than we would wish as foreigners. And this, of course, is the first clue. Pinyin was not built for us, it was not built for foreigners learning Chinese, and most cases can be understood in that light. A good example of this would be the U with the dots, and why does it sometimes lose the dots? Well, it only does that when there is no ambiguity. And what I mean by that is in a syllable like lu, there are no dots obviously because it's an U sound, but in lü, green, you do have dots, and that is because if you didn't have the dots, you wouldn't know if it's lu or lü. That means that there is ambiguity without the dots, hence you have to add them. However, in a syllable like chu, there is no ambiguity because there simply is no sound that is pronounced chu or something like that. It doesn't exist. Q and then u does not exist. So there's no reason to write this. It's just unnecessary and adds things you need to write. And why do it? Why bother? Naturally, native speakers speak fluently when they start learning Pinyin, and they don't need to think about which syllables exist in the language and so on. So for them, it would just be annoying to have to write the dots. Another question that many students ask is why some letters are written differently if they are the first in the syllable or not. So an example of that would be U, which is written with a W if it comes first. So for example, the syllable one is pronounced with an U, but it's spelled W-A-N, one. Then of course we have I and U, which have an added Y in front of them. So for example, if you want to write language U, you do that with Y-U and then no dots. Or the number 1 is I, it's just I, just one sound, and yet it's written Y-I. And why is that? Well, this is also for practical purposes, because if you didn't do this, parsing would be much harder. And by parsing here, I mean splitting a longer word into correct syllables. And this is a little bit hard to talk about, but if you look in the written article, I have an example of wenyan, which looks very weird without these W's and Y's, and would also be possible to split in many different ways, making it much, much harder to read. Finally, one might also ask why there is so much overlap going on with the vowels. We saw that I, A, and E, for example, are used for so many sounds. And this is nothing weird. Most languages do this. We have more spoken sounds than we have vowels in the alphabet, so that's bound to happen. And again, remember, this wouldn't be a problem if you spoke Chinese before you learned Pinyin. It is only a problem if you're trying to learn to pronounce Mandarin through Pinyin. I also encourage you to think about pronunciation in bigger units than letters. So for example, don't think how is A pronounced. Instead, learn that an is pronounced in one way and ang is pronounced in a different way, which solves the problem. I would also like to point out that the question of why a certain letter can be read in many different ways is a little bit backward. We're actually starting with a spoken language, so the correct question is, why is one letter used to represent several different sounds in the spoken language? And the answer is that this is not a problem for native speakers, it is only a problem for us. Okay, well done! We made it through the entire episode, and it took about 20 minutes. Of course, it's difficult for me to explain these things in the length of a podcast episode, but in the pronunciation course, most lessons are this length or longer, which means that I have plenty of time to go through all the details and also build a more solid foundation about how sounds work in general before I go through how all the initials, finals, and tones are pronounced. Like I said earlier, you can find out more information about the course by going to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. And if the course is not open when you get there, you can always leave your email address and I will notify you when it opens again. In the meantime, good luck with your pronunciation. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.